All right, guys. Um, just like I did in the last screen capture video, I believe I've done one. My memory's not great. Anyway, I'm going to walk you through what you're looking at on the screen here. This is Jarvis. Of course, I should begin with, as the syllabus reads, I would hope you would read Jarvis before you watch this video. If you haven't, you should stop right now. You should go do that because I'm going to operate under the assumption that you're familiar with this article. So yeah, you're not going to get a lot out of it if you haven't done that. Anyway, to begin with, as I've said several times now, this article is longer than probably what you're used to. I mean, I imagine you don't read a lot of scholarly articles, right? The good news is you only had to read the first half, but as a result of that length, her introduction is also longer than you guys are used to, right? In your own papers. So I wanted to break that down first. Keep in mind, it's almost like I do this sort of thing for a reason. The way we talk about introductions, the way that they're built structurally, she's still following that. Like that's a very real structure that everyone uses. So even though hers is much longer and in some ways more complex because it's 3 paragraphs and all that stuff, she still has a hook, a roadmap. She introduces her texts. She has a thesis. She has all those parts. And as a result of her following that structure, if you can get a pretty firm grasp of the big ideas in her introduction, I think it can really help you follow all the twists and turns she goes through in the paper, right? So anyway, let's get into it. I will say here again, not only should you have read the paper by this point, but for the next couple minutes in the video, I'm going to be talking about the introduction specifically. So maybe just go ahead real quick, review those first 3 paragraphs. Won't take 2 minutes to skim those, read those, and then come back. So go do that. All right, that was my pause break. Hopefully you did something there. Anyway, she's got an epigraph here. We're actually not going to talk about that. Her first paragraph in her introduction, which is easily the longest paragraph in her introduction, what is that? What part of the intro is that? If you take like 2 seconds, really think about what she's apparently writing about versus whatever this paragraph is doing. This is her hook, right? It's hella long compared to the rest of her introduction, but without getting too in the weeds on this, because this won't matter to you so much, just know that this isn't super uncommon in an article like this. If you think about the kind of people who are normally looking up scholarly articles, doing research, it's almost like just a nice thing to be like, hey, here's a really interesting historical whatever, right, at the beginning. And of course, it applies to what she's going to talk about. But suffice to say, all this stuff about Nixon, Vietnamization, which was a real thing. This is all like really, I would say, because I think history is cool, a really interesting piece of background information because when Vietnam was going on, when all this was going on, 1970, I mean, Vietnam had been going on for years before that. Vonnegut was writing his book. It was published in, and I'm using my memory right now, I think 1969, thereabouts. So the world she's trying to introduce you to in this first paragraph, that's the world that the book existed in. So it does apply. And double trouble, she's talking about Vietnam, she's talking about war. Obviously, Vonnegut would have been thinking about that. He mentions it a few times in the book specifically, but again, there's no way he's writing an anti-war book, quote unquote, and not thinking about Vietnam in some kind of a way when he's doing that. So the interesting pieces from this paragraph, to me, it's always Nixon ordering screenings of patents. Some people don't know what that means. What that means is the president, you can go places, you can do things, but when you do, you kind of got to take a small army with you. You know what I mean? Like it's you can't just go to the movies or anything like that. So they have a theater in the White House, like a small theater, and the president can just be like, "Hey, I want to watch this," and they'll queue it up for him. He is the president after all. And in this case, Nixon, over several days, ordered several screenings of Patton, which is a World War II epic about General Patton. And Jarvis gives you a little bit of description of the movie there. But again, what's interesting here, I mean, the way to put it, maybe in a context you would understand, he's basically binging this World War II movie over a couple days repeatedly. Uh, that's interesting, considering the policy decisions he's making in and around that time. Um, Obviously, Jarvis is implying, and I think she states actually explicitly at one point, that it really seems like the approach that Patton takes in the movie uh, colored Nixon's perspective, had him thinking about Vietnam in a particular way in terms of like how he should approach it. Um, and all of that, just to be totally clear, is crazy, right? The fact that an American president would sit down and go, let's look to this movie for some wisdom. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that is bananas. But I would hope, me talking about all that, I would think it'd be pretty clear how that starts to apply to some of the conversations we've had about Vonnegut, right? And if it's not clear, well, it'll hopefully become clearer here in a moment. I want you on the lookout as you're reading anything, and again, I would hope you're doing this by this point, but keep in mind the way we're using these papers, Jarvis included, because she's assigned, you want to find quotable material. You're going to have to pull evidence from your different sources, put them in your paper, talk about them. And there's all kinds of great quotations in this article. Some of my favorites from that first paragraph. I have them written down. Give me just a second. When she talks about Patton, the appeal of it. She says World War II offered a clear-cut, decisive victory. Now, what does she mean by that? Well, think about it. We're America. Who are we fighting in World War II? We're fighting the Nazis. It doesn't get, much clearer cut, decisive, not only because we win the war sort of emphatically both in Europe and in Asia, but the people that we were fighting, we discovered the concentration camps at some point in there. Like it's really easy to feel like you're the good guy when you're fighting people who are committing genocide, right? So as a nation, not only did we feel great because we won, and we talked about that a little bit with some of the poems, but it's who we won against. That idea you measure yourself by your enemy and whatever they stand for is what you're against, that sort of thing. It's very easy to feel good about yourself, about America, about the war, all those things, um, given the context. And so she goes on to talk about the bad war here at the end of the paragraph being Vietnam, and the good war, which is World War II, because it makes us feel good. I'm not sure how up on Vietnam you guys are. It is widely sort of publicized as the first war that people saw on TV. News reports every night would have like images or video from Vietnam, and people get to see a little bit more of the reality. Up until then, all they had were movies like Patton, Sands of Iwo Jima, she talks about here later, and much like we've talked about with movies, they don't, necessarily get it right. And a lot of folks seeing this stuff from Vietnam coming back were, we'll say, less than enthusiastic when they were met with that reality. Um, Not least of which because we were on one side in the Vietnam War and they were fighting other Vietnamese people, and it was a question of like, should we be intervening when it comes to sort of a country deciding what they're going to do amongst themselves? Like, there's all kinds of questions here. None of them clear cut, decisive. It's harder for us to feel like we're doing the quote unquote good thing. I'm not saying we were the bad guys, and I'm not saying everyone even thought that, but it's so much harder to make that case as opposed to how World War II is often depicted, talked about, thought about. And that's where this idea comes from. So in the late 60s, early 70s, Vietnam, quote unquote, bad war, World War II, quote unquote, good war. In the next paragraph, she introduces her texts. She's going to talk about Gravity's Rainbow. We Are Not. That book is somehow more insane than Slaughterhouse-Five, if you can believe it. We're not going to talk about that. Slaughterhouse-Five, though, she talks about it. She brings it up within this context of Vietnamization. And right in here, it's very quick, and it's kind of basically half. Her roadmap is like the second half of this paragraph, okay? And again, it's fast, but Slaughterhouse-Five, I'm just going to read some of it at you, revealed that the war in Vietnam was shaping representations of World War II. That's the part I really want you thinking about. What she's basically saying is, again, Vonnegut, for our purposes, was thinking about Vietnam, what he was seeing on TV, and he was like, you know what? The way we think about World War II is kind of BS. Like that's not how it was. I've seen all these movies too. They don't treat the source material fairly. It's much closer to how people are talking about Vietnam now back then. And so they wrote books, these two people that she talks about, sort of in light of that reality that they wanted people to recognize. Here later, she says these books deconstruct the binary framing of the good war and the bad war, and talking about multiple shades of gray. Basically, it's not all bad, although Vonnegut seems to think war is pretty bad. Nothing is ever completely bad or completely good. And they want to, again, sort of take that idea and think about World War II in that way. After that, she's going to really explode those notions here in this last paragraph. This is, I would say, her thesis. And it's a whole paragraph. Now, bear in mind, it's only actually a couple sentences. There's some long sentences in here. But she really boiled it down in the previous paragraph. If you can hang on to that last idea she had, she's going to add some stuff about bodies in here. I'll just say, if you have questions about that, like on an individual level, or you'd like to discuss it, you can discuss it with me. But for the purposes of this video, trying to make sure I boil this article down in as digestible a fashion as we can, I'm going to leave that body stuff for another day. But again, where's the language we're really interested in? She talks about the Cold War, which Vietnam was a part of, allowed these writers to reimagine, reconfigure cultural narratives. We've been talking about those surrounding masculinity and the Second World War. This is really her first mention, I think, of masculinity in the introduction. But notice how she's joining those two ideas. Notice how she's talking about narratives around both, just like we've been doing in class. And again, I do think Vonnegut is interested in re-examining how these two things work, how we think of them versus maybe what's more realistic, or what have you. Again, she goes on to talk about the good war, the bad war. We want to complicate that notion, and then she's into fragmenting bodies, all this stuff that, to be quite honest with you, in a class like this, this last section is a little bit above your pay grade. So if you want to use it in your paper, talk about it, talk to me about it, all that's fine. Don't feel pressured to do so, though. All right. So that's the introduction to the paper. Again, I have a firm belief that if you can really grasp these first 3 paragraphs, you have a better than good chance of being able to follow the rest of the paper. And hopefully, if you didn't feel that way before the video, you feel that way now. Last thing I want to do, what we were going to do in class, and this is what I want you to do in your discussion board, which I'll post after I finish this video. I want you to, now that we have 2 texts, we have Jarvis, we have Slaughterhouse-Five, and we will have talked about both. I want you to attempt a bit of synthesis. Now, a note about that. Jarvis, pretty clearly, if you're looking at the screen right now, talks about Slaughterhouse-Five. So intentionally, I mean, why I chose it, it makes it kind of easy to make connections between her article and Slaughterhouse-Five. However, I will tell you, if all you ever do is say, ooh, here she talks about something specific from the book, and then you just talk about that thing, that's not doing a whole lot of work because she specifically talks about that part of the book. Do you see what I'm saying? That could be a first step. That could be a really sort of easy way in to getting to the book, but you need to take that conversation somewhere else than just what she does. And she offers you other opportunities. So, for instance, I really love, and I have students every semester that really are troubled by this first body paragraph. To be clear, this is the beginning of the paragraph. She has what's called a block quotation, which you guys should never have because your papers are like 4 pages. Hers is like 24 pages. But anyway, paragraph, quotation. This is the end of the first paragraph, all right? I didn't want you guys confused. So this is all one paragraph. What is she talking about in here? If you're not sure, again, go read it real quick. I'll give you a beat to go review this first body paragraph. Go ahead. Okay, so she starts out, again, with a little bit of history of war movies. Obviously, we've been talking about that too, right? More on that in a second. She gives you a pretty okay body paragraph, block quotation, sorry. But then here at the bottom, this is the interesting stuff, right? I keep telling you, look for quotable material, stuff you can use, something that says more than it does on the page. Do you know what I'm saying? Now, in this case, there's not necessarily language here. I mean, there's some patriotic fervor, things like that that you could maybe quote. But to me, it's really worth a paraphrase, this last paragraph, because what are we talking about? First of all, Sands of Iwo Jima, 1949 World War II movie. So 1949, we're only a couple years out of World War II, starring John Wayne. Sounds a whole lot like stuff we've talked about. And what do we learn about the movie? We don't learn a lot. We learn a little bit about the character. Sounds unconventional in some ways because he's troubled and whatnot, but pretty conventional in the important ways. It's a patriotic movie, which it absolutely is. But here's the interesting part. Marine recruiters set up booths in the lobbies of theaters following the movie's 1950 general release. And then it talks about this anecdotal thing. The writer's dad, Jarvis's dad, saw people lining up to sign up. They were coming out of this war movie, see a Marine recruiter, and they're like, I want to do that. Isn't that the most fucked up thing you've ever heard? You're going to, like, look, most of you are around about this age. Imagine you go see a war movie and you're like, oh, that's awesome. Or if contemporary context, you walk out of the theater and like, do you want to be an Avenger? And you're like, yeah, it looks great. Like, it's not. Do you see? Like, it's there's no way any of that is fair, or I'm gonna go ahead and say should be legal. Like, that's crazy. That's crazy. And that's our first reaction. I wanted to have it with you. I would assume you had a similar reaction to that information. Of course, that's not really what we're doing in the paper. What we're doing in the paper is, if we were to paraphrase this, try to pull a quotation, there's some stuff in here again that you could pull and talk about. What do we do with it? Well, we're synthesizing. So I'll just put it like this. Reading over this information, what do you, I would think, immediately think about when it comes to Vonnegut? You think about Weary, right? His true war story that he was going to tell his folks, or just even the idea like of how he carries himself when they're behind enemy lines, like he thinks he's safe. And the question is, well, why does he think that? The book doesn't really get into that. Well, when you have a real world example of kids Weary's age doing exactly what Mary is worried that kids like Weary are going to do, I would contend it almost writes itself, right? You could talk a little bit about Weary. You could quote Mary if you want here. You paraphrase Jarvis. And now we're talking about not just war narratives, which we absolutely are talking about that, but more specifically, we're talking about the effect of those, what they do. Basically, what Vonnegut is saying that they do, but it's a book, right? It's fiction, and then a real world example of, oh no, this absolutely happens, and here's documented, cases of it, and from there you're building a body paragraph. Now, depending on the other sources you will find at some point, you don't have to have those today. Don't freak out. You may have another text to bring in. You may not. This could probably be enough for a body paragraph in your paper. But this is the kind of work you want to do. Again, she's going to talk about Slaughterhouse-Five specifically down here. She's going to cite specific moments. For instance, she gets to Mary, right? Pretty clear how she gets from here to Mary. But what you wouldn't want to do if you were to quote something from this paragraph probably is talk about Mary in that case, because she does, but you could easily get to Weary. Some of you pointed out yesterday you could easily maybe get to Rumford or Derby. We've talked about him in that context. But again, the name of the game to start this paper is just making those connections and explaining to me how that connection works in terms of the ideas that each text has, if that makes sense. So if you can start this process today, again, that's what the discussion board is for. If you can start this process between Vonnegut and Jarvis to the best of your ability, respond to a couple classmates, I really think that'll do a lot to sort of get this train rolling. I would honestly say it could help you when it comes to research, because now you have a really good idea. If you've already started making some connections between the two texts that we have, you have a really good idea of what else you might be looking for. That's my hope anyway. I hope everyone is well. And the off chance anyone is curious, sometimes you guys will hit me up, which I appreciate. Sam is fine. He's just, I mean, they're being super cautious, which I totally understand at his school. So he can't go back tomorrow, and my wife was really sweating what we're gonna do about that, and I was like, we could just, I'll do it online, you know. Anyway, uh, hit me up obviously with any questions you might have. Stay stay kind of next to your inbox if that makes sense, because I will keep contacting you as is necessary. I'm hoping we can go back very soon, but again, that's not entirely up to us with the world that we live in right now. So we just want to be respectful of all the whatever that his school has, for obvious reasons, but also he is fine, everybody's fine, and it's just kind of what it is to be a parent. So I'll catch you guys on the other side, and just let me know once again if I can help in any way. All right. Thank you.